Welcome back to the second half of today's program, sponsored by the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, Rethinking the Human Sciences. My name is Rosalind Morris, and I'm very pleased to be chairing this afternoon's panel and introducing our really extraordinary contributors to the discussion, Roberto Esposito and Hent Vries, both of whose works have been of great significance to many of us in many parts of the diverse community, which is ICLS. Just to introduce the format, I will introduce our speakers, who will each speak for approximately 30 minutes each. We will then have a response of about 15 minutes, and we will open up the conversation afterwards. Let me begin then by introducing Roberto Esposito. His curriculum vitae would spin across the entire length of this room. He is the author of 20 major books and is indeed one of contemporary Italy's most prolific, most cited, and most engaging political theorists. His work has addressed the major ideas and problematics of contemporary philosophy and political theory. He has touched upon the works of Machiavelli and Schmitt, Hannah Arendt, Simone Weil, the works of Foucault, of Jean-Luc Nancy, and indeed he has offered us many concepts that have redirected thought of our own moment. I won't give you the list of the 20 volumes that he claims to have authored. My Italian would start a small war. But recently we have begun to read these in English. He is the author of 3 very significant volumes: Bios, Biopolitics and Philosophy; Communitas, The Origin and Destiny of Community; and Immunitas, The Protection and Negation of Life. Professor Esposito is going to give us a paper entitled The Return of Italian Philosophy, and he will be followed by Hent Vries, who is the Ross Family Chair in Humanities and Director of the Humanities Center at Johns Hopkins University. Hent Vries' interests cover questions in European thought, the histories of violence, the problem and the critique of metaphysics, philosophies of religion, political theology. For those of us who are not in philosophy, he is the author of, or rather the editor of, several enormous volumes that allow for those of us in the other social sciences, anthropology, sociology, political science, to engage with theology. And these Bible-sized tomes are absolutely mandatory reading. Hent's own books include Philosophy and the Return to Religion, Religion and Violence, Philosophical Perspectives from Kant to Derrida, Minimal Theologies, Critiques of Secular Reason in Theodor Adorno and Emmanuel Levinas. Hent is also in the process of producing another multi-volume series of works for the University of Chicago entitled Of Miracles, Events, and Special Effects. This is volume 1. All part of a series on the politics of global religion in the age of new media. I won't say more. You're here to listen to them and not to me. I would, however, like to introduce our respondent, Patricia Dailey, who teaches here in the Department of English, where she specializes in medieval literature and culture, critical theory, and where she does work on women's mysticism, Anglo-Saxon poetry and prose, medieval rhetoric, hermeneutics, and deconstructionist ethical philosophy. I'll make one final note, which is that we will take questions in English. Our speakers will speak in English. However, Professor Esposito will answer your questions in Italian, and Patricia will translate for you. Without further ado, then, I'll invite Professor Esposito to the podium for his first presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, thank you. Thanks, Statis, Rosalind Morris for this presentation. Thanks to Columbia University. I apologize for my bad, very bad English. So, a number of signs seems to be telling us that the time has come again for the return of Italian philosophy. Apart from a few exceptions, in the early 1990s, the image of Italian philosophy has faded it appeared more like a land for conquest by non-Italian thinkers, more like than an independent site for innovative conceptual work. Over the past few years, the situation seems have been reversed. The number of Italian philosophers translated and discussed around the globe is increasing rapidly. From America to Japan, Germany to Argentina, and Brazil to Australia, philosophy is beginning to speak Italian in an unprecedented way. Certainly contingent factors play a part, and waves of interest can recede, but they still mark an important transition in the regime of contemporary knowledge. As is the case with other philosophical traditions, over the course of the last century, Italian philosophy today appears to be in profound synchrony with the dominant features of our time. Even when elaborating on theoretical paths already embarked on in other places, the Italian interpretations give the impression of contributing something more, a semantic intensification, a force of insight that had been missing elsewhere. For instance, what has taken place recently with the categories of nihilism, secularization, and above all, biopolitics. Coined in the mid-1970s by Michel Foucault, biopolitics had to wait until the end of the 1990s to enjoy a diffusion that has made it a theme of global importance for contemporary philosophy. Why? Why is it that after some 20 years of inactivity, the biopolitical paradigm had been translated into Italian before it could achieve its current transnational resonance? We can provide an indirect answer to this question. The good fortune of Italian thought is also a positive effect stemming from the exhaustion of other, more noble philosophical traditions. If analytic philosophy shows increasing difficulty in enlarging its audience, and German hermeneutics has lost its initial charge, French thought seems to be in no better health, still grieving over the loss of its most prestigious figures, from Foucault to Deleuze and Lyotard to Derrida. French thought, which continues to produce important texts, naturally, tends to shut itself up in a circuit of brilliant but sometimes increasingly repetitive and self-referential formulation. What's the underlying cause? What kind of malaise does contemporary knowledge suffer from? I don't think that it is reducible to a difficulty of communication or to a generational change. There is something more. There is something more than that. I believe that the reason for their retreat can be laid at the feet of the dominant role played by the sphere of language in the 20th century, one that Italian philosophy was spared. While analytic philosophy came into being explicitly as a critic of language, hermeneutics views the interpreting subject as always immersed in a pre-given linguistic situation. The same holds true for deconstruction, according to the linguistic turn that even in the first decades of the last century, grouped together in the same self-critical register authors as diverse as Heidegger and Wittgenstein, Frege and Gadamer, Appel and Lacan. I would argue that this linguistics option is closely implicated in the waning I spoke of earlier. Once language, given the irresolvable diversity of its dialects, declares itself to be incapable of formulating models of universal rationality, there seems to be no other remaining space for philosophy except that of elaborating on its own internal crisis. Italian philosophy took a different road from this self-dissolving trajectory I have just sketched out, but not because the linguistic sphere failed to provide a terrain for philosophical investigation in Italy. On the contrary, from its beginning with Dante and then throughout the period of humanism up to Vico and Leopardi, language was one of Italian philosophy's main pillars, but always in close relation with the constitutive categories of Italian thought, namely history, politics, and life. Long before other philosophical traditions, Italian thinkers understood that after the linguistic fault, we now face a new turn, a different epochal transition that has at its center the question of bias. Or expressed differently, they understood that the transcendental of our time, its constitutive category, is life and no longer language. From beginning of Italian thought, from Machiavelli to Bruno to Vico, the categories of life, history, and politics, in their complex relationship, has sheltered Italian philosophy from the transcendental horizon in which great part of contemporary philosophy remains bound up. Clearly, such a recognition isn't limited only to Italian thought, but Italian thought seems to have a leg up on other traditions because it has always been deeply immersed in such an encounter. Unlike the philosophical culture that from Descartes to Kant was concentrated on the genesis of subjectivity and the theory of knowledge, on metaphysical queries of formal logic, Italian thought from its origins was directed toward historical and political life, rather than turning inward to the constitution of an interior consciousness or to defining its own linguistic order. Italian thought looked outward onto the world. If we include in the ranks of Italian thought authors such as Machiavelli and Leopardi, Leonardo da Vinci and Galileo, Vincenzo Cuoco and Francesco de Santis, as I think we ought to, then we can say that the principal object of Italian philosophy is something that exceeds the philosophical lexicon, or indeed that is non-philosophical. In this sense, we might say, using a famous expression of Foucault's, that Italian thought is indeed a thought of the outside. It is a thought of the world and a thought turned toward the world. Before proceeding, I want to ask an important question. Is it really legitimate to speak of Italian philosophy as one does of French or German philosophy? Is it possible, or does it even make sense to think of philosophy as belonging to some nation? Or would it be more accurate to say that philosophy, as in the case for mathematics, medicine, and music, does not have any national connotations, precisely because it always speaks a universal language? I think the answer to this first question is yes, philosophical knowledge is never unrelated to the context in which it is born and develops. It's concerned with space no less than time. Naturally, by context, I don't mean a space enclosed by and lying within predetermined borders, but rather a set of environmental, linguistic, tonal characteristics connoting a specific mode that is unmistakable when compared to other styles of thought. Thinking Deleuze right in what is philosophy takes place in the relationship of territory and earth. But what he calls earth doesn't refer to the fixity of a picture frozen in time, which is to say to the ineluctability of ethnic or anthropological roots. On the contrary, it implies a complex dialectics in which territory is only one of two poles opposed by the inverse and simultaneous movement of deterritorialization. This is why geophilosophy doesn't coincide at all with a philosophical nationalism or with a national variety of philosophy. This is especially true for a thought such as Italy's, which in its most glorious period enjoyed neither a state nor a nation. Beginning in the 15th century, Italian authors developed their own thought outside of national boundaries. Anything but enclosed within its own autochthonal borders, the distinctive trait of Italian thought is the refusal of philosophical nationalism, something that is instead typical, for instance, of the German and in part of the French tradition as well. Unlike other European countries, the great Italian philosophy of Machiavelli, Bruno, Galileo, Campanella, and Vico did not come into being along with or following the formation of the national state. On the contrary, it very much preceded this development. The formation of the Italian state neither conditioned nor was conditioned by Italian philosophy. Italy didn't enjoy anything like a national culture, like that of Spain, France, or England, which were buttressed by their respective states without political borders and a center. For centuries, Italy remained an extraordinary terrain for the elaboration and diffusion of the only great European culture with a non-national status. This was because humanism went beyond the national and for this reason was experienced as potentially universal. What it is for the better or for the worse? Was it a limit or a resource, a restraint, or a driving force? I believe that both interpretations contain a kernel of truth, but that today, with things being as they are, it makes sense to emphasize the positive rather than bemoaning what Italy failed to possess. It's better to look at the differential energy that runs through and fills this void. This is also because we are not dealing with a political void, with an absence of civil engagement or intellectual courage. On the contrary, the greatest Italian authors, from Machiavelli to Bruno and Campanello to Galileo, had relation with ecclesiastic and political authorities that were tense and troubled, leading in some cases to resistance and even to the ultimate sacrifice of their lives. In this sense, even before speaking of a philosophy of power, Italian philosophy is a philosophy of resistance. Bruno was burned in Campo de' Fiori. Campanella was thrown into prison for years. Machiavelli exiled, and Galileo forced to recant. Out of this insubordination, asserted as an element of the same thought, something arises that returns later in another context, namely encroaches in intransigent opposition to fascism and in the defense unto death of Gramsci and Gentile's thought coming from opposing sides of the same barricade. Unlike other philosophical culture, which are marked from their origins by the relation with a politically strong and consolidated institution, as in Hobbes' England or Descartes' France, unlike tradition of thought dedicated to constructing a state knowledge as in Fichte and Hegel's Germany, in the Italian philosophical culture, thought about the political was and in certain sense continues to be outside the state, in the productive and contrasting relation of unity and plurality, identity and difference, power and resistance. It's no accident that, along this line of thought, contemporary Italian philosophy has expressed a potential antagonism that is difficult to find in other contexts. Sometimes, in specific circumstances, as in the case, for example, of the drastic transition between epochs that we have been living under for some time now, this lag, which might seem to be a defect or an anomaly, can become an advantage with regard to other situations that appear to be more stable. Not being situated on the perimeter of the national state, but placed on the shifting line that joins and juxtaposes Italian cities, Italian thought has from its origins traveled a path free of roadblocks. For this reason, now that the time of the nation is running out, or at very least when its assumptions and ends are being called into question, Italian thought can face the future with greatest innovative energy. This also explains the return of Italian philosophy. But it isn't the only reason. While Italian philosophy is situated in a difficult and conflicting relation with the nation state, it does remain to a large degree distant from the logic and the languages that prevail in modernity. This doesn't mean that Italian thought lies outside them. According at last to its greatest interpreters, Italian thought has always been in constant interaction with the authors, texts, and voices of the philosophical discourse of modernity. But it does so from a perspective that cuts diagonally across modernity's essential features. What characterizes Italian philosophy in its depths and over the long term? I will describe them a stance that is open and receptive to historical and natural forces which the philosophy of the early modern period experienced as unbearable risks from which it had to immunize itself. The most significant philosophical and political categories of modernity, subject, sovereignty, and progress, can ultimately be interpreted as a reaction to the risks associated with a new era that modernity was entering into, as apparatuses of protection against chaos, against conflict, against the unexpectedness of ungovernable events. One can say that Italian thought has always been situated outside of this immunitary horizon. For its greatest authors, from Machiavelli to Bruno to Vico, conflict, contingency, and the event are not something against which people need to preventively immunize themselves, but are instead the basis of human experience, its original source of force and energy, to which it is necessary to return when civilization seems exhausted by an excess of rationality. Italian thought doesn't fear an encounter with the extraneous, the unformed, or the irreducible, with everything that is uncontainable, with the walls smoothed over by logos and exposed to the violence of contradiction. On the basis of these observations, let me set out the three essential features that I believe have characterized Italian thought until today. The first is an affirmative or perhaps inclusive position with regard to conflict. Without the vital energy of conflict, order closes in on itself and implodes. If modern philosophy, from Hobbes to Hegel, is anchored by the political transcendence of the state, entirely sacrificing conflict to order, Italian thought, beginning with Machiavelli, thinks the political outside the state. What thus emerges is a constitutive relation between immanence and conflict. Conflict is inherent to a reality that cannot be transcended in a different dimension. It's no accident that for Gramsci it was Machiavelli who anticipated the political party in his icastic figure of the prince, specifically in the sense of taking part, parteggiare, and being partisan. This is inevitable in a world riddled and molded by conflict. For Gramsci, the world of life is cut through by pervasive struggle in a fight for hegemony. Whether we like it or not, we are always forced to take a position in favor of one part against the other. Not by chance, the political debate that opened in Italy during the 1960s and 1970s in the most theoretically innovative school of thought, workerism, operaism, took up again the question of the relationship between antagonism and form. If the question of conflict is the most innovative way Italian thought thinks the political, the approach of Italian thought to history instead is distinguished by the way it removes history from the philosophies of progress that, beginning in the 18th century, were prominent in modern knowledge. The densest theoretical site of such an awareness, indicated by the break between the order of history and the flow of time, is, of course, the work of Giambattista Vico. In contrast with subsequent philosophies of history, no matter how it is regarded, historical order is irreducible to the pure flowing of time, and indeed is always held in abeyance by the possibility of its catastrophic regression. Cuoco's historical essay on the Neapolitan Revolution of 1799 arose out of this problematic awareness that relates history to its internal limits. The revolutionary catastrophe of 1799 was caused by the idea that history was obviously oriented toward the better, regardless of context, and also regardless of the part of nature that is constituted by the human. The third influential paradigm of Italian philosophy is an idea of community that conceptually towers over that of the individual, just as it does the abstract and disembodied subject. What emerges in Italian thought is a deconstruction of the Cartesian division between reason and body, but equally of the individualistic liberalism that runs from Locke to Mill. Italian philosophy, with both the limitation and the strengths that derive from this exception, took shape outside this argumentative machine. From its very inceptions, Italian philosophy contested the idea of an absolute individual, one removed from social relation. Of course, Italian thinkers are well aware that politics is also, and at the time above all, made by individuals, as in the case for Machiavelli's Prince, but in a form that can never be separated in an abstract way from the collective dynamics out of which they arise on each occasion, and with which they must nevertheless contend. The scene of Italian philosophy is continually crossed by multitudes of men and women in relation and in tension with one another. The profound inspiration behind the recent return of Italian philosophy of the theme of communitas can be traced back to this horizon. Consider too the category of praxis in Gramsci. Praxis only acquires its meaning in the overcoming of the abstract separation between subject and object, reason and body, politics and life. Of course, behind a thought of this sort lies a particular interpretation of Hegel, one that nurtured Italian philosophical culture from De Sanctis to Spaventa to Croce. However, in no way does this detract from the impetus going back to the very foundation of Italian tradition at whose origin is to be found the thought of Giordano Bruno. There remains an even more radical element that has to do with Bruno's explicit and insistent critique of the category of person, whether divine or human, in favor of infinite life. The rejection of the presumed separation between soul and body, spirit and nature, subject and object, was united in Bruno with the idea of a living cosmos without center and without borders. Subjectivity was not excluded, but rather placed inside and integrated with the process of the self-generation of the world in a form that only Spinoza, the most Italian of modern philosophers, would later advance with similar force toward the philosophy of the impersonal. Obviously, what I have sketched out here is a map, only a map, or to be more precise, a partial genealogy oriented toward a particular point of view, but this is always the case of philosophy. Italian philosophical culture undoubtedly contains other themes, other concepts, and other facets. What I have emphasized here are the ones I consider to be most representative and innovative. As with every discourse, mine has been performative on this occasion. When describing a reality in movement, discourse tends to steer its direction, redefine its confines, push reality beyond itself. At stake in this dialectic between thought and action is the role and possibly the future of Italian philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Esposito. Our next speaker is Hent de Vries.
I would like to begin by thanking Stathis Kourgouris for his kind invitation to participate in this colloquium. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. I would like to thank Ros Morris for her kind introductory words. When I saw the program and realized that I would be speaking immediately following Roberto Esposito and just before Patricia Dailey, I knew from what angle I would like to approach our theme, namely by taking an all too brief detour through a philosophical oeuvre that I have mostly kept at bay, hesitant what to make of it, despite its unmistakable influence on the human sciences broadly defined, and even though it clearly resonates here and there with themes and concerns that I deeply care about. Rethinking the human sciences in light of the so-called archive, taking this concept as a profoundly philosophical notion, first of all, while emphasizing the continuities at least as much as the differences between old and new ones, from spatially located documentary storage places to mechanical systems, to digital networks, and their increasingly mobile devices, I thought I might take my lead from an Italian author and short text here in this context, a short text whose relevance for my own work, again, and an author whose relevance for my own work, again, I have been late and am still somewhat reluctant to admit. I'm thinking of a very small essay published by Giorgio Agamben in 2006 and entitled, if I pronounce correctly, Che cos'è un dispositivo? What is an apparatus? This brief text of some 20-odd pages presents itself as a quasi-philological footnote to a central concept and idea discussed, if not introduced, Agamben demonstrates, by the later Michel Foucault. The concept, namely, of le dispositif, translated as apparatus, or also as construction, machinery, device, and deployment. But as we will see, Agamben's short essay is also highly programmatic and instructive beyond the explicit theoretical aims formulated in the writings of both Foucault and his interpreter. For one thing, the technical term dispositif, or apparatus, sheds light on the concept of the archive, old and new. For another, it contains some directions as to how the study and practice of the human sciences, more generally, can be rethought. This said, I will argue that the Foucauldian understanding of the apparatus, that neither the Foucauldian understanding of the apparatus, nor, for that matter, of the archive and its archaeology, developed, as you well know, in the 3rd and 4th chapters of L'Archéologie du Savoir, the archaeology of knowledge, nor even Agamben's sympathetic retrieval of these historically and philologically related concepts, that these theoretical inquiries fully exhaust what I would take to be the near metaphysical depth and normative or pragmatic relevance of the archive, whether single or plural, old or new, of the archive as indeed the preeminent site for philosophical fieldwork. Let me explain then what I mean by these concepts of archives, while largely parsing over, leaving for another occasion, I hope, what exactly a site or what fieldwork in or as the proper method of philosophy might mean here. Perhaps we can speak about that in the question round. Agamben's little text revolves around an understanding of Foucault's apparent rediscovery of the historical term and idea of le dispositif, a, quote, decisive technical term in the strategy of Foucault's thought, Agamben says, notably in his writings and lectures on governmentality from the mid and late 1970s onwards. In a philological tour de force, Agamben relates this term back not only to the use of the word positivity, positiviteit, in Hegel's earliest theological writings, notably the Positiviteit der christlichen Religion, he also, and for most of us, I guess, somewhat more surprisingly, inscribes this technical term into a much older ecclesial, that is, Christian theological archive, more precisely into a Trinitarian idiom, of which Foucault may or may not have been fully aware when he first introduced the term, that is, dispositif, apparatus, into his conception of the archaeology of the human sciences and the general method of genealogy he devised for it. The reference to Hegel, Agamben suspects, comes to Foucault via Jean Hippolyte, Foucault's master by his own admission, and might have been drawn simply from the former's famous Introduction à la philosophie de l'histoire de Hegel, its third part. However, the reference to the Church Fathers enters Foucault's text from a far greater distance and stems from a near immemorial past that Agamben begins to unearth here, explaining that at the time of writing The Archaeology of Knowledge, published in 1969, Foucault still uses the Hegelian term positivité, an etymological neighbor of dispositif, Agamben adds, however, without providing much of a definition. Indeed, we have to wait until a late interview published in 1977 under the title The Confession of the Flesh for a concise and precise response to the very question as to what dispositif or apparatus might mean and what methodological function it fulfills in Foucault's writings. Here's Foucault, as cited by Agamben. What I'm trying to single out with this term is first and foremost a thoroughly heterogeneous set consisting of discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical, moral, and philanthropic propositions. In short, the said as much as the unsaid. Such are the elements of the apparatus. The apparatus itself is the network, the réseau, that can be established between these elements, end of quote. For Hegel, positivity, as in the phrase positive religion, and distinguished from so-called natural religion, which Agamben recalls expresses the immediate and general relation of human reason with the divine, had designated, and I quote, the set of beliefs, rules, and rights that in a certain society and at a certain historical moment are imposed on individuals, end of quote. That is, it connoted, and I quote again Agamben in his paraphrase here, it connoted the historical element, loaded as it is with rules, rights, and institutions that are imposed on the individual by an external power, but that become, so to speak, internalized in the systems of beliefs and feelings, end of quote. As Hippolyte had noted, and as Agamben recalls, for Hegel what was central was the dialectic between pure reason and the historical element. And the latter constrains, indeed negates the former, but interestingly also thereby robs it of its mere abstraction and thus, quote, adapts it to the concrete richness of life. For Foucault, Agamben goes on to explain, the dispositif, again translating Hegel's or perhaps Hippolyte's sense of positivity, likewise comes to replace the abstract universals, les universaux, of state and law, sovereignty and power, while continuing to play, and this is a Agamben, while continuing to play a decisive structuring role as part of a series of different operative concepts with a general character. Apparatuses, Agamben writes, are in point of fact what takes the place of the universals in the Foucauldian strategy, not simply this or that police measure, this or that technology or power, and not even the generality obtained by their abstraction. Instead, an apparatus is the network, le réseau, that can be established between these elements, end of quote. It is this reference to a certain machinery or informational device that interests me most here, and that makes Agamben's retrieval of the philological background of the Foucauldian terminology all the more pertinent, I believe, giving the current transitioning from old to new archives in the human sciences and indeed globally, in the expansion of markets and media, a new pertinence. Agamben observes that the term dispositif has a variety of meanings, according to the French dictionaries, especially those that do not pay sufficient heed to its etymological density and the historical development and articulation of a unique original meaning that he writes, that we should not lose sight of. At least for Foucault, Agamben notes, the term clearly refers to, quote, a set of practices and mechanisms, both linguistic and non-linguistic, juridical, technical, and military, that aim to face an urgent need and to obtain an effect that is more or less immediate, end of quote. Again, it is this reference not only to the network or the set, but also to the urgent need faced and the more or less immediate effect obtained that is relevant here, not least since it defines the historical archive, together with religion's institutional positivity, in ways that open new avenues of thought and research, genealogical and other, for the human sciences today. Indeed, if we are to believe Agamben in the brief essay under consideration, but elsewhere, notably in a recent study entitled The Kingdom and the Glory as well, we cannot theorize or rethink the archive without acknowledging an at least historical continuity or formal resemblance between the archaeological approach to knowledge and power that Foucault proposes here and an unmistakable theological, or more broadly, deeply metaphysical and weak ontological register on the other. A certain pragmatic context of the term apparatus becomes especially clear, Agamben demonstrates, if we look into one of the precursors of this term, which is the Greek concept of oikonomia, economy. For this term connotes not only the administration or management of the oikos, the household, but also, witness Aristotle's politics, a praxis, or in Agamben's words, a practical activity that must face a problem and a particular situation each and every time. However, it was only much later, and this historical given in particular captures Agamben's most recent interest, that the, quote, theologians, he mentions Tertullian, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and Clemens of Alexandria, but there are others too, that the theologians slowly got accustomed to distinguishing a discourse or logos of theology on the one hand and a logos of economy on the other. Oikonomia became thereafter an apparatus through which the Trinitarian dogma and the idea of a divine providential governance of the world were introduced into the Christian faith, end of quote. With this established, Agamben's essay has sketched out part of a much larger project, whose original, if not necessarily ultimate, type of inquiry and interpretive method is described here in terms of a, quote, theological genealogy of economy and government. Indeed, for a theological genealogy of economy and government, is the subtitle of this book, The Kingdom and the Glory. The complex details of and theological reasons, notably the justifications of the Trinity of God, Father and Son and the Holy Spirit, that is to say, of divine providence and Christ's incarnation, for this divine economy to be put in place, need not occupy us here. Suffice it simply to note that the Greek term oikonomia was rendered by the Latin fathers of the Church as dispositio, and that for Agamben this translation and interpretation inaugurates a crucial distinction, nothing short of a certain fraction, caesura, indeed schizophrenia, between God's being in and for himself, his nature and essence on the one hand, and his action in the phenomenal world, that is, his operation or governance, administration of creaturely affairs on the other. The term oikonomia, and then also dispositio, which in Foucault's hands will become the dispositif or apparatus, thus marks the very difference between ontology and praxis, but also, one might add, between mysticism and engagement that has haunted Western culture ever since, and whose current analogues Agamben goes on to detect in the remainder of his essay. Indeed, in the complete series of books that conclude the multi-volume project of Homo Sacer in its latest installments. In so doing, Agamben reveals a dual perspective, or, as I'm tempted to say, a dual aspect theory of reality and of politics, which is diagnosed in explicit clinical, not to mention pathological terms, and in fact, I would add, expresses no small doses of paranoia with regard to the total administered world, die verwaltete Welt itself, albeit this time in a Heideggerian and Benjaminian garb, and without any direct reference to the Horkheimerian and Adornian Marxist cum Weberian presuppositions, upon which this terminology, that of the administered world, would need to be based to acquire some precision, some concretion, precisely in Hegelian terms. Of course, one may well wonder why this must be so, if the theological or ontotheological basis of the divine economy and providential order, and by extension of the modern apparatus, is, as Agamben suggests, to be found in some analogical continuity, rather than strict opposition, between the three registers of the Trinitarian logic and everything they stand for. Yet the theological register in which he ascribes Foucault here offers, in fact, a resolutely Manichaean reading of the triad, more in particular of the Father on the one hand and the Son and the Spirit on the other. It is significant to point this out because Agamben's overall strategy consists in opening the religious archive in the widest possible sense of the term, only then to give a very restrictive, in any case, limited reading of it. In a bold move, extending the division made by the Greek term oikonomia, the Latin term dispositio, and the French term dispositif, Agamben takes the possible range of meaning of apparatus one decisive step further, well beyond the political, theological, and genealogical or archaeological domains that Aristotle, the Church Fathers, and Foucault take to be these terms' exclusive references. As he develops their central motifs and most representative texts, quote, a point of undecidability opens up, where it becomes impossible to distinguish between the author and the interpreter. As this point is reached, Agamben argues that the scriptural intent of the author or authors in question must now be abandoned. Agamben thus proposes to, quote, situate apparatuses in a new context, end of quote. And again, it's here, I would claim, that a major contribution to the task of rethinking the human sciences is made. Indeed, echoing the distinction between God in his very being and God in his providential action, Agamben proposes, quote, nothing less than a general and massive partitioning of beings in two large groups or classes. On the one hand, living beings or substances, and on the other, apparatuses, in which living beings are incessantly captured, end of quote. Or again, he differentiates between the, quote, ontology of creatures on the one hand, and, quote, the oikonomia of apparatuses that seek to govern and to lead toward the good on the other. Indeed, the expensive use of apparatuses reaches even much further, and both forward and backward. I quote, further expanding the already large class of Foucault's apparatuses, I, Agamben, shall call an apparatus literally anything that has in some way the capacity to capture, orient, determine, intercept, model, control, or secure gestures, behaviors, opinions, or discourses of living beings. Not only, therefore, prisons, madhouses, the panopticon, schools, confession, factories, disciplines, juridical measures, and so forth, whose connection with power is, in a certain sense, evident, but also the pen, writing, literature, philosophy, agriculture, cigarettes, navigation, computers, cellular telephones, and why not, language itself, which is perhaps the most ancient of apparatuses, one in which thousands and thousands of years ago, a primate inadvertently let himself be captured, probably without realizing the consequences he was about to face, end of quote. What is important to note here is that Foucault's notion of dispositif, as Agamben interprets it, thus serves as a reminder that the religious, theological, political archive, in its concrete historical positivity, consists of much more than theorems or theologies, dogmas and concepts, rituals and sacraments. To fully weigh its import, we further need to be sensitive to its far more expansive, pervasive, if often elusive, invisible grip on virtually every domain of psychic life, indeed, in all the forms of life, in which power establishes itself, that is to say, virtually everywhere. This near all-encompassing sense of the global apparatus, Agamben goes on to suggest, expresses itself precisely in what the later Heidegger in Die Technik und die Kehre calls the technological Gestell or framing, a term that implies yet another disposition or positing, in Latin ponere, in German stellen, albeit one on an even grander scale than the so-called positive religions, with their onto-theologies and divine economy ever dared to imagine. Agamben notes, it would probably not be wrong to define the extreme phase of capitalist development in which we live as a massive accumulation and proliferation of apparatuses. It is clear that ever since Homo sapiens first appeared, there have been apparatuses. But we could say that today there is not even a single instant in which the life of individuals is not muddled, contaminated, or controlled by some apparatus. In what way, then, can we confront this situation? What strategy must we follow in our everyday hand-to-hand struggle with apparatuses? What are we looking for? What we are looking for is neither simply to destroy them, nor, as some naively suggest, to use them in a correct way, end of quote. Aside from their impossible destruction, then, and our cowardly adaptation, what options precisely are there? It is here, indeed, that things in Agamben's suggestive analysis, with its near-apocalyptic, bleak diagnosis of the signs of the times, gestures to a powerless, increasingly fractured, split, indeed schizophrenic subject, while stressing philosophically, indeed metaphysically, that things do not need to be what they are. Let me briefly explain. At the heart of the theological origin of the term oikonomia and dispositio, as it continued to cast its long shadow on Foucault's use of its derivative, dispositif, or apparatus, lies thus a more fundamental insight and worry that precisely undoes what had just been established. The fact, namely, that this technical term indicates not just the firmness of history's grip, however accidental and inadvertent its original event at the dawn of humanity and of humanization may further have been, but also the radical, indeed absolute groundlessness of all positivity, of every dispensation, of each apparatus. As Agamben summarizes his argument up to this point, the Latin term, I'm quoting, the Latin term dispositio, from which the French term dispositif or apparatus derives, comes to take on the more complex semantic sphere of the theological oikonomia. The dispositif about which Foucault speaks are somehow linked to this theological legacy. They can be in some way traced back to the fracture that divides and at the same time articulates in God's being, in God, being and praxis, the nature or essence on the one hand, and the operation through which he administers and governs the created world on the other. The term apparatus designates that in which and through which one realizes a pure activity of governance, devoid of any foundation in being, end of quote. It was Foucault's inestimable, and we now know fundamentally theological insight, that it is precisely because apparatuses have no fundamentum in re, and hence are ideological hypostases and abstractions, a flatus focus of sorts, that a subject and a process of subjectivation that almost completely submits to their power must always be posited, and indeed comes into being alongside and in the apparatuses, whose ultimate non-being it masks, sustains, and contests or protests. On Agamben's reconstruction of the Foucauldian view then, one can, quote, call a subject that which results from the relation and, so to speak, from the relentless fight between living beings and apparatuses, where there is no guarantee or hold in being divine or other, where all action and economy needs all the warrant and support it can possibly get. The subject carries all the justificatory weight. The subject camouflages the powerlessness, more precisely the lack of authority of all power, just as it is a mask or masquerade of it. Agamben then agrees with Foucault. Every apparatus implies a process of subjectivation, without which it cannot function as an apparatus of governance, but is rather reduced to a mere exercise of violence, end of quote. Put differently, all historical determination, from divine providence to the total administered world, is ultimately, that is to say, metaphysically, or as Agamben would prefer to say, ontologically contingent, however much the apparatus and its subject in question may seek to make this forget or gloss over in a variety of seemingly sacrosanct ways, by sacrificing the community, the common being, and use of being and things, that it thus sets aside and separates from a more original form of life. Again, a theological genealogy, Agamben asserts, can demonstrate that this is nowhere clearer than in the way religion, at least in its old Roman definition of religio, and here a whole set of problems opens up that I cannot go into, operates. Two types of subtraction then seem at work here, and I will conclude with these. Whereas Agamben takes religion, first of all in the strict Roman definition, to mean the setting apart and separating of things, places, animals, or persons in a sacred sphere owned by the gods, thus subtracting them from the free circulation or commerce. He introduces the equally ancient Roman term of profanation to designate the contrary movement, by which he means the restitution of their original common use, the restoring of their original ownership. Profanation is thus the second subtraction, whose sacrilege consists in the fact that its acts undo, that is, violate and transgress upon, this, quote, special unavailability of these objects, which were reserved either for the celestial beings or for the beings of the netherworld. More specifically, for Agamben, profanation, which becomes the counter apparatus, is the very undoing of separation, and thus the exact opposite of sacrifice, which is the reverse movement of the passage of something from the profane to the sacred, from the human sphere to the divine, operating via a series of minute rituals that vary in function, Agamben recalls, from culture to culture, and which Hubert and Mose have patiently inventoried. Yet, and this will be my concluding remark, need one accept Agamben's somewhat stereotyped characterization of religion when he writes that, quote, one can define religion as that which removes things, places, animals, or people from the common use and transport them to a separate sphere. Or rather, when he adds even more suggestively, quote, that not only is there no religion without separation, but every separation contains or conserves in itself a genuinely religious nucleus, end of quote. One could say that this somewhat massive definition presupposes that the sacred or consecration, stemming from the Latin word sacrare, together with the apparatus that activates and regulates its acts and processes of separation, namely sacrifice, exhaust the meaning and force of the religious, including the theological and theological-political, whose genealogy Agamben traces here. It further assumes that its counter-movement can simply be an inverse and subversive act of a second separation through profanation alone, which this time aims at the restitution of beings and goods to their supposedly original role in the sphere of common use. This being said, we are invited, I think, in Agamben's text to move from the historical and empirical understanding of archives as made up of elements, words, and things, discourses and propositions, but also institutions and laws, to what in Heideggerian parlance we could describe as a formal indicative view and use of the very a priori, episteme, and network for which this archive, in its very concept, still stands. The term and the concept of dispositif, or apparatus, derives precisely its strength from the very fact that it hesitates between these two meanings or uses of the historically concrete and the merely abstract, or indeed draws on both. The genealogy of this terminology, like that of so many others, can thus reveal that rethinking the human sciences at every juncture requires an explicitly and indeed resolutely ontological or metaphysical, in any case more thinking, questioning of the unsaid or inactuality, we might also say potentiality and virtuality that every archive entails. It reveals that the latter is captured all too quickly in an idiom and imaginary, or into a terminology that frames or economizes its critical counterpoint all too securely. And even Agamben's own praise of the process and practice of profanization, returning spaces and things, being and objects, to their common use, from which sacralization supposedly separated and removed them, may well be such a gesture. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor de Vries. We are now going to hear from Patricia Dailey.
Thank you both for such rich papers. And I've approached this as some way of trying to answer the question of how would I fit Agamben into the outline that Esposito has presented us with. In what ways would he trouble that model that he's given us? Since he's somebody who isn't mentioned in your talk, but obviously who's someone, when we think of Italian thought today, is somebody who everyone is contending with, especially in the human sciences. So that's how I'm kind of approaching this. So and thank you, Hent, for admitting your struggling with Agamben, as I think many do, in terms of a certain, you could say, level of criticism, which has even become quite popular nowadays of Agamben, but which has clearly engaged him globally in ways that we need to contend with and need critically to think through. So I want to think this in trying to kind of think this aloud. So although I find that Esposito, Roberto Esposito, has struck a promising note in his characterization of, you could say, this idea of conflict and as essential or part of a certain kind of mode of Italian philosophy. Although I would be far more skeptical of the move to separate Italian philosophy from its French counterparts in the ways described, for reasons which I cannot fully elaborate here, but which I'll attempt merely to sketch out. Roberto Esposito has selected a model of action and conflict, and a thinking that, as a historical totality, does not abstract the subject, you could say, from its embodied political force. He cites some of the most notable and admirable philosophers to come out of Italy with this in mind, namely Gramsci. But also one hears, although not cited directly, and I'm not sure if you took this out of your paper, but in any case, Negri and a lesser-known figure, Mario Tronti, when he says, "Not by chance, the political debate that opened in Italy during the 1960s and 1970s in the most theoretically innovative school of thought, operaism, took up again the question of the relationship between antagonism and form." For those of you who do not know, Tronti authorized the groundbreaking book Operaia e Capitale in 1966, in which he calls for a redirection of attention from the operation of capital to the worker's role within the system. Tronti helped to usher in a new logic of empowerment that led to the movement of autonomia operaia, in other words, the worker's autonomy, and represented, along with Negri's pioneering work, the first inklings of the changed physiognomy and rhythm of contemporary labor. I am tempted to hear a kind of philosophical apotheosis and Esposito characterization that culminates in the 60s and 70s, in which, during the anni di piombo, the years of lead, the years of violence, both on the part of the extreme left, the Red Brigade, as well as on the extreme right, you could say a precedented political and philosophical innovativeness redefines new paradigms of community embodied collective autonomy according to a model of resistance. In the years that followed, philosophical discourse, that means years that followed, i.e. post-70s, philosophical discourses certainly modified their objects of discourse in relation to new modes of production. Negri's work on empire, Agamben's work on biopolitics, as well as your work on biopolitics, and the lesser-known Paolo Virno, who diagnosed incisively the current forms of life and struggles with the affects, you could say, of capitalism, from cynicism to skepticism. Yet in between these optimistic models, if you want to call them that, is another side of Italy, which would certainly not fit the paradigm Esposito advocates, or I'd be interested to hear how it does, and which I think are also important for a critical assessment of what resistance means or could mean in Italian thought and politics today. And Hent, I think you're offering us a very interesting way of invoking Agamben while critiquing him at the same time, thinking through his reading of Foucault and the way he's reappropriating the profanation as an actual praxis, if you want to call it that. Excuse me. On the other hand, if one were really to read according to historical context in the Italian case, one could diagnose a symptom of Italian philosophy and politics in its current day. That is, of the nostalgia or need, and I mean it in a positive sense, need for conflict and resistance as a model. One need think only of the rhetoric of the coming revolution in the works of Negri, and I remember translating, for example, his essay that he was writing in response to Derrida's Spectres of Marx, which he had first titled Communism's Hope. And I said, you might want to change that. And he said, okay, it turned out to be the Spectre Smile. And Derrida, in the volume, now I'm forgetting the person who did the responses, all the responses of Spectres of Marx with Derrida's response. Derrida also offers quite an interesting critique of Negri's rhetoric of liberation. In any case, so I'm thinking of this Negri and also a contemporaneous phenomenon within Italy itself, that of the strange absence of any significant political voice of opposition to be operative in Italian politics, once the years of lead were followed by the years of what they call the cotton ball, the Anni di Bambagia in Italy, and as period which followed thereafter, a period of great economic prosperity, the miracle of the Italian economy of the 1980s, in which Italy was, you could say, one of the top 6 leaders in this economic boom. I want to highlight this, not to diminish the idea of praxis, which Hent has very astutely brought back into perspective as fundamentally related to what we conceive of as the dynamic nature of the archive in this hesitation between the register of the historically concrete and the merely abstract, and its need for this critique of the unspoken in the human sciences as part of its response. Rather, I want to ask how we would, for example, situate Agamben in this model within the context of another Italian philosopher who, like Agamben and Negri, have risen to prominence in part through their export to other countries after the 70s, that is, namely philosophers like Vattimo, the promoter of what he calls weak thought. By no means do I consider Agamben to embrace the weak thoughts of Vattimo, even though there were interesting ties, for example, in Vattimo's, in Agamben's relation, for example, to Calvino and the origins, you could say, of his understanding of biopolitics very early on in France. But by no means do I want to consider Agamben to embrace this weak thought of Vattimo in ways that people like Alain Badiou have characterized him, which I guess you took out of your talk. Agamben has always been a better reader of Heidegger and far more interested in the politics of Foucault to be situated in this register. Nevertheless, I bring up the perhaps embarrassing shadow of Vattimo to raise a few points. I want to borrow here I want to lean on a brilliant forthcoming book by Alessia Ricciardi entitled After la Dolce Vita, A Cultural Prehistory of Berlusconi's Italy. It's forthcoming from, I think, Stanford, correct? Which offers a very sobering analysis of how, I quote, this is quoting Ricciardi, the leftist intelligentsia managed in a few decades, and most decisively from the mid-1970s through the 1980s in Italy, to lose the position of intellectual and social centrality that was handed to them after the defeat of fascism and the end of the Second World War. She looks at how, I quote, the specific ideological constellation revolving around the Italian appropriations of postmodernism and post-structuralism helped to prepare Berlusconi's rise to power and monopolistic grip on the means of social organization. She's doing so not in some ways to say that postmodernism and post-structuralism are complicit with this, but rather in the appropriation of these models, how exactly they're promoting this kind of consolidation, you could say, with apparatuses, if you want to call it that. Ricciardi argues that Berlusconi's conquest of Italian society was facilitated, not intentionally, but philosophically, by, I quote, intellectual contributions largely from the left, namely the conservative belletrism of Italo Calvino's 6 Memos for the Next Millennium, which aspires to resuscitate a literary aesthetics of taste, Gianni Vattimo's post-structuralist doctrine of weak thought, and Achille Bonito Oliva's art historical movement of trasavanguardia. Ricciardi writes, my goal is not to decide whether certain thinkers are truly postmodern or not, but rather to understand how some of the most important figures of the once leftist intelligentsia in Italy came to celebrate the logic of the market. And she goes through at length to kind of look at how people like Vattimo celebrate, along with people like Eco and Calvino, the kind of semiotic plenitude that the structures of postmodernity in some ways enable, according to the market and to spectacle. Whereas French society's engagement with what one easily calls postmodernism and post-structuralism proved both philosophically and politically generative, in the sense that it was both critiquing, you could say, the economy and both, you could say, the product and the dispositif at the same time through the structure of critique. And also, and I'm just going to add a little anecdote, also allowed for people like Alain Badiou, who promoted extreme left responses like Maoism, to live there and teach, and even hosted people like Negri and others in exile from Italy after the 70s, and for them to teach in France. Italy's reaction, both politically and culturally, you could say, to that phenomenon was very, very different. And the legacy of this persists in very different ways. In this light, I think the criticism made by Hent, de Vries, regarding... Oh, you actually took this out, so I'm sorry about that. But you say that it's Agamben's his irresponsible claim that, that left and right-wing policies have become virtually indistinguishable, that one in some ways needs to reconsider Italy as part of this formulation, and the ways in which you could say post-structuralism had a different kind of genealogy in Italy than it did in France. And also, more importantly, in trying to think through Agamben's philosophy, if we can call it that, how it sees itself as a disruptive model that does not look to, or maybe it does look to, conflict and resistance in the model of the ways that Esposito has described here, but as philosophical and political critique, in other words, in the French sense, so trying to kind of see these more or less opposed in the ways that they've been sketched out to be. So in that sense, if, as Mastrantonio and Bonanni have argued, the society of spectacle has replaced civil society in contemporary Italy, then Giorgio Agamben's tracing of the genealogy of spectacle through a theological route back to the phenomenon of glory might represent a form of practice, i.e. a form of critique for the human sciences that, as you point out, are very compelling. So, thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. What I'd like to suggest is that our speakers, can you hear me? Yeah. I'd like to suggest that our speakers take an opportunity to respond very briefly if they would like, and then we've got time to take questions from the audience, and we can open this into a discussion. But let me begin by asking Hent and Roberto if they wish to add some remarks or to add their own questions to each other before we open.
Vuole aggiungere qualche cosa?
No, se c'è qualche domanda rispondo. No?
Io posso dire...
se mi fai una domanda
sì,
precisa.
Certo.
Sì.
Nel senso, ovviamente, di come pensare un filosofo come Agamben, come l'ha presentato Hent, nel suo sistema di pensare la filosofia italiana. Cioè,
sì.
Diciamo, l'Italia nella situazione contemporanea com'è, come pensare il politico, siccome non si può pensarlo nello stesso modo in cui si può pensare il conflitto come era pensato. Lei pensa che Agamben può entrare in questo modello o non lo vede così?
Lui direbbe di no perché esclude di entrare in qualsiasi modello. Lui risponderebbe.
Okay.
Secondo me, diciamo, io ho cercato di tracciare un orizzonte complessivo all'interno del quale poi ci sono delle differenze notevoli.
Posso tradurre?
Sì, certo.
Okay. So he said, if he would say that even Agamben would say he doesn't fit, or he would never fit into the model that he himself has described, that he's given kind of a general outline.
Sì.
Yeah.
Se posso sinteticamente dire la differenza tra la mia posizione, quella di Agamben e quella di Negri,
sì,
in poche battute.
Sì. So if I could just explain, or in some ways, in a very few words, describe my philosophical differences in comparison with Negri and Agamben.
Naturalmente sono entrambi due amici che stimo molto e che lavorano molto bene. Diciamo che Agamben ha una tonalità teologico-metafisica.
Posso tradurre prima?
Sì.
So he's saying that he has very great esteem for people he considers his friends, namely Agamben and Negri, but he's saying Agamben occupies a certain kind of philosophical register that's both metaphysical and religious.
Naturalmente una teologia negativa di tipo messianico, ma la categoria di profanazione è una categoria teologico-politica perché presuppone il sacro.
Right. He's saying that ultimately Agamben's thinking in some ways relies on the very theological model that it's critiquing, that it requires that kind of theological metaphysical model even when it's proposing the model of profanation. Sì,
ecco, mentre invece il paradigma di immunizzazione non è un paradigma teologico-politico.
However, his paradigm of immunization is not a theological political paradigm.
In più io cerco di dare anche una tonalità storica al mio discorso, mentre Agamben destoricizza radicalmente, nel senso di Heidegger, la tradizione occidentale. Quanto poi a Negri, Negri adopera una categoria più economica che politica, che è la categoria di produzione.
So where, ho già dimenticato cosa ha detto sull'Agamben,
che destoricizza,
destoricizza,
cioè elimina la storia.
That he's dehistoricizing. Okay, that in some ways Agamben is already dehistoricizing the philosophical,
sì,
in that sense.
Per cui per Agamben la biopolitica coincide con la sovranità.
For this reason, biopolitics coincides with sovereignty. For Agamben.
Mentre invece Foucault pone delle discontinuità, delle differenze.
Right. But for Foucault posits discontinuity. It doesn't posit the same kind of, and posits a number of differences. And Negri, he says, mostly relies upon economic models rather than philosophical models.
Fondamentalmente Negri ritiene che la rivoluzione è già in corso, è già in atto.
Right. For Negri, the revolution is always is still happening or is happening.
È di fatto la liberazione del lavoro vivo nella globalizzazione. Quindi paradossalmente in Negri non si coglie la linea del conflitto. No?
So for Negri, because he in some ways is already seeing, especially in, you could say, contemporary the globalization and new modes of you could say materialities, that's my word, not yours, that he's already seeing a kind of a liberation happening, or ahut.
Naturalmente entrambi, Agamben e Negri, hanno molto rinnovato il panorama filosofico italiano e anche io ne ho subito l'influenza, ovviamente.
He said both Negri and Agamben have significantly added to, you could say, and resuscitated or regenerated Italian philosophy, which have also influenced my thinking too in the process.
And do you want to add to that? And then I'm going to take 3 questions in a row, and then we'll respond to those.
One thing that I didn't translate was that what important point of what you were saying is that, interestingly enough, because the revolution is in some ways already happening for Negri, there is no language of conflict at this point, so that conflict in some ways is absent.
Perché siccome la contraddizione nasce all'interno dell'impero, non c'è una linea di scontro, diciamo il lavoro vivo che si libera è una pura immanenza.
Okay, so work in some ways as it's conceived is a pure immanence. In some ways you can't really demarcate the ways that in which
il soggetto del conflitto è la moltitudine, ma la moltitudine stessa è qualcosa di indefinito,
right, but the multitude in and of itself is indefinable, it's indeterminate, it's not a specific concrete individual, but located at the level of subjectivity in that sense, yeah.
Hent, do you want to add here?
Yes, maybe just this, I think that what I confronted with the enormous task of discussing this question, rethinking the humanities, and especially in light of the problematic of new challenges, cognitive revolution, new technologies, new media, my reflex was, let's just discuss the small text. At the same time, I was intrigued by this little text by Agamben, again a philosopher on whom I have not sufficiently worked yet, but and with whom I have some difficulties of placing the larger thrust of the argument, or appreciating perhaps enough what that all amounts to. What I was struck by is this invitation to take a question of philology or philosophical terminology as very seriously and as the point of departure and an invitation to a wider, deeper, more probing thought. And lo and behold, the terminology leads us into the question of genealogy, archaeology, but more in particular of a genealogy of a theological, religious archive. And what I was struck by is that Agamben bravely, provocatively, outrageously picks up this notion of the dispositif, of the apparatus, and extends it way beyond the question of of language, way beyond the question of what we traditionally would call an archive. So that it virtually covers everything that you would read in Heidegger when he speaks about ontic positivity. Everything that belongs to the order of beings and is organized in a certain way. That now fits into the question of apparatus. So this concept becomes extended, expanded, radicalized, propelled into the possible future that we can imagine, and projected all the way backwards into the beginnings of humanization. But then, at the same time, the essay is inspired by a paradox, and that's where the question of ontology, weak ontology, perhaps not, but certainly some sort of a Franciscan ontology, as Badiou critically but also tenderly says, comes in. Because the essay is also inspired by the fact that I think what is very important, namely, what is it that remains indestructible, or what remains, as he puts it here explicitly, ungovernable, if the apparatuses are basically covering all that exists and govern and administer everything that we can possibly name and experience. And that ungovernable offers little reason for hope, and even much less for resistance. And at the same time, it is that which, without which we could not even begin to think an apparatus, let alone the set of apparatuses that now map out the totality of what is. And I would tend to disagree with the characterization that ultimately this kind of genealogy, this kind of philosophical philology, if you like, is theological per se. Because the theological archive is used as a heuristic resource of sorts, ultimately adapted in a, as I said, formal indicative way, so as to open up into the question of what Agamben then with Heidegger and Rilke and in passing calls the open. And that is not necessarily a religious notion or a theological notion, I would claim. That there are many aspects that are deeply problematic or troubling. For example, a certain persistent technophobia, or the equation of apparatuses with the whole world not just becoming totally administered, that had been said before, but also then describing that total administration in terms of, let's say, the formal figure of a concentration camp. That those are things that I think are deeply problematic in the text. And there perhaps one would have to contextualize this more in light of what Professor Esposito was sketching, indeed the context that Agamben emerges out of. Maybe not in the narrative and the highlights that you gave, but as part of the narrative that Alessia, indeed, Ricciardi is bringing out.
Let's take a question, Status. You've raised your hand here.
Yes, very quickly because we don't have much time. I haven't read the Agamben essay, and maybe for this reason this is not a fair question. But I was struck by the strange translation of economia to dispositio. This is a strange translation, and it's already rigged, as it were, by an understanding of the Trinitarian organization as an organization that inheres separation, though obviously in unity, but separation. While the three, not even separation, partition, that's the word you used. I think that's even more interesting word. Because in the, let's say, first theorization of Trinity by Gregory of Nazianzus, right, as the one in stasis with itself, right, or stasis in itself, which is a very peculiar notion that resists partition in favor of a certain dynamic undoing, making, remaking, and so on, for all the permutations of stasis, which of course you know very well. So I'm thinking that I'm not here to defend orthodox theology or theology of any kind, as you know, but I do find this in some ways, if everything rests on this very problematic translation, because economia as a, let's say, original word, concept, is not a word that organizes by partition, but by relation. And I think the nomos of the oikos is by relation, not by partition. And that is, it seems to me, a very important difference.
Okay, we're going to add 2 more questions. There's one question here and one in the back there. So thank you.
What I'm struck by in your discussion of what is an apparatus are the massive erasures that go on to build the construction you discuss. The erasures of politics, for example, as the arena in which the apparatus or apparati are consistently modified, changed, etc., and the erasures of what I would see as the other half of the technogenetic spiral, that is the human fashioning of apparatuses in a continuing cycle and spiral of innovation, change, adaptation, and so forth. And then finally, I just wanted to mention a project that my colleague at Duke, Mark Hansen, has undertaken, where he has people read Agamben's text while being monitored by biometric indicators that show those sections to which they are especially attentive. And then,
would love that.
and then he has a program which erases all the rest of the text, and what you take home with you is your version of Agamben, that is the sections to which you have attended, as based on unconscious indicators such as galvanic skin response, and so forth. So I would be interested to know whether you see this as the manifestation of an apparatus or as the subversion of an apparatus.
And one last question in the back, and then we will ask our speakers to respond as succinctly as possible. Unfortunately, we do have to close up. We started late, and we need to move on as well.
My question is more with Agamben and not with your presentation of Agamben, which I think is accurate. First, all the authors that you mentioned prior to the 4th century was a distinction between oikonomia and theology actually occurs. It appears for the first time in Eusebius. So all the writers he's speak about oikonomia in the Godhead. And Agamben in the book, he changed his version, and then he speaks of oikonomia as originated in the Godhead. So the problem is that oikonomia is a much more complex concept, because oikonomia appears in the 4th century and onwards as the appearance of the incarnation, which is the appearance of the divine inside the world. So the connection between theologia and oikonomia, between God in himself and God as he appeared to us, are much, much more complex. And from the divine side, they're not as the same as they're from our side. The distinction between oikonomia and theologia is a distinction of human capacity to know God, which is encompassed in the oikonomia, and theologia is what is outside. It's the apophatic theology. It's what human consciousness cannot appear. Also, as to distinction, in Tatian the Syrian, who's one of the first church fathers to explain to us what oikonomia, it's not distinction, it's distinction by inclusion. And he put it against, if I recall, diaretis, which is distinction by cutting apart. So oikonomia always makes distinction, but it makes distinction by inclusion and not by cutting apart. I think that another thing that has to do with dispositio and dispensentio, which is the 2 ways that oikonomia is translated, especially in Tertullian, is, I cannot recall, but if I recall, dispositio is as divinity in the Godhead, and dispensentio is as divinity in the Word. And in later Latin, they use dispensentio and not dispositio. So I think Agamben's way of treating patristic is inaccurate, and also of treating Foucault, which I can go on later, but my time is up.
But alas, we must, as I said, we're going to ask our speakers to respond very briefly, and we will take these questions away to coffee and for the rest of our lives.
Se posso aggiungere una cosa su disposizio,
Okay,
eccetera.
you'd like to add one thing on dispositio?
Dietro il concetto di dispositivo, come lui ha accennato, c'è il Gestell di Heidegger, o anche quello che Heidegger chiama Mobilmachung, che implica sempre un elemento di enigma e di inganno. Intanto questo.
Sì. I'm going to have to ask you again, but behind the concept of behind this concept. He wants to trace certain other concepts that are kind of lurking behind Agamben's, namely the Heideggerian concept of Gestell,
Sì.
and as well as the
Mobilmachung.
Mobilmachung. Hent, how do you translate that?
Sì, ha qualcosa di enigmatico ed ingannevole.
Something that's both, you could say, enigmatic and
E di inganno,
deceptive, uncertain.
Sì,
Yeah,
nel senso che è qualche cosa che si presenta con l'apparenza del suo opposto.
In the sense that it's something that presents itself while seeming to be its opposite, in that sense.
E cioè si presenta come una relazione, quella che è una divisione.
It presents itself as a relation, but in fact it's actually a division rather than a relation.
Oppure è una apparente inclusione che di fatto esclude.
Or it's an appearing inclusion which in fact excludes.
Bisogna tenere sempre presente questa dialettica del concetto di dispositivo.
You have to keep this concept of dispositive active when you're thinking about it in terms of this idea of inclusion and exclusion and the way it's operated.
Per esempio, l'economia divina significa che Dio ha l'autorità sugli uomini, ma non governa Cristo, quindi c'è una divisione all'interno dell'economia divina.
So when applied to the sense of the divine economy, that God, come l'ha detto? Che
ha un'autorità.
That God has an authority over all creation, but it's Christ who's actually governing. So that's what he wanted to add.
Sì.
Yes, just a quick response, if I may begin. I think Agamben would be horrified with Mark's experiments and find in it a confirmation of the totale Mobilmachung that he sees in technology on a rampage. So there are specific references precisely to the biometric revolution that he takes again only as a becoming number of the subject, as it were. So I think I cannot imagine any positive appreciation in the experiment on Agamben's part, but maybe I would love to ask Mark what he thinks of that. And then indeed all the technical, very important discussions about the history of Christian theology and Trinitarian theology, the meaning of oikonomia, dispositio. I think, yes, I have not much to add about this. What strikes me as remarkable, even though Agamben elaborates this somewhat further in the book, The Kingdom and the Glory, but not, I think, sufficiently to give answer to these two excellent questions. What seems to me happening is that in Agamben's central intuition here, two things collide, two definitions, conceptions of religion collide. It's the Roman notion that he somehow lifts out and then interjects into this understanding of the Christian notion of divine governance and its oikonomia. Hence the importance of a certain interpretation of sacrifice, the sacred and sacrilege, profanation, and that doesn't mean that he has no knowledge of the Christian idiom. There is the book on Paul. There is a profound understanding of a notion of messianic logic. But I don't see how these two different vases actually communicate. So I'm somewhat at a loss. But what I would like to say in concluding is that what I do find that for all these aspects that one should discuss and perhaps critically question, what I do find important is Agamben's intuition that indeed these questions of philology, terminology, even a certain textuality are somehow invaluable vehicles in order to push questions of a philosophical nature, of a theoretical nature further, even if one is to discuss issues of contemporary technology. I think that seems to be the issue. That seems to be the central intuition. And then one step further also, and that I find very interesting, there seems to be in Agamben, in this philological approach, a certain fantasy or a certain idea, a regulative idea of total recall, namely that it is precisely the most contemporary questions that are finely attuned to the most archaic archives, as it were, and intuitions that we find there. So that nothing is ever past, nothing is ever over and done with. These most obscure issues in Christian Trinitarian theology become the key to understanding, indeed, a critique of biopolitics, a critique of the technological gestalt. And that I find provocative and somehow comforting that whatever technological and cognitive revolutions there may be and must be, a very essential part of what the humanities used to be about, namely the interpretation and recalibration of notions in traditional archives remains firmly in place, even though we would probably read them other and better guided by these contemporary questions.
Okay, thank you. On that note, I'm going to have to close the panel, and I know that many of you still have questions. You'll have to pursue them with our speakers outside. We have a 10-minute, in fact, really 5.5 minutes that will slip into 7 minutes break before we start the next panel, in which we'll hear Stephen Chapin and James Gleek. But in the meantime, join me in thanking Roberto Esposito and Hent Vries.